So my name is, I guess, Dr. Caitlin O'Loughlin. I just finished my PhD at the University of North Carolina's School of Education. And my research is largely in queer education history. And I also look a little bit at kind of current education policy, particularly as it pertains to queerness and narratives of queer students in education.
Well, thank you for talking to us. And today we're going to be talking mainly about your article. It's Just Filth, Banned Books, and the Project of Queer Erasure that came out in November of last year. So maybe if you could begin by telling us how you came to this article and what you found while writing it.
Yeah, so we started with a broader topic, which was that we were really interested in this phenomenon that we had noticed of parents at school boards taking the same couple books and kind of screaming about the same kind of quote. So Lawn Boy was the big one a couple years ago when this paper was being kind of formulated. And we began by watching, frankly, too many hours of school board meetings and noticing that first that there were a couple books in common, and we can get into the how of that. It's actually kind of interesting. There's a spreadsheet that these parents have that you can have access to that has the book and the quote and why you should want it. But that was actually a little bit more interesting to us was that the rationale across the board, and we looked in Florida, New Jersey, Texas, a couple other states, is that the books were filth, that they were obscenity, that they were pornography. And that this was not just related to books like Lawn Boy that have consensual young adult sexual relationships, but also involved books for young children that had nothing that could be construed as sexual. I mean, Entangle Makes Three with the gay penguins was one of the books that was considered obscene. And it also related to books about race. So any book that talked about, Black experiences in America, police brutality, those were also being labeled as obscenity. And so we were really interested in tracing that phenomenon of how, what gets defined as obscene and who does that work. Because if you look at like the school board meetings and you look at the laws that are being passed, if you look at the Don't Say Gay bill, DeSantis's, refrain was that the bill doesn't say gay anywhere in it. And so how can you say it's anti-gay? The bill doesn't say the word gay. You're saying that it's gay. And so we were curious, in clearly people understand without being told that what is the obscene material is queer material, but how do they understand that? That's what we were interested in.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. And also, to begin that discussion, I think we should talk about how what you guys called epistemicide. I think I'm saying that right. And what that means is wiping out knowledge and representations of queer people from schools to reinforce the primacy of normative identities. So could you tell us what that means and how this erasure begins to take shape, even before we talk about like the bills itself?
Yeah, so you could actually trace this back. I talk about it a little bit in the paper, but it actually goes back to the anti-pornography laws of the 60s and 70s that were formulated pretty broadly around gay panic, and an idea that gay men were kidnapping young boys and forcing them into pornographic sex rings. That's actually where anti-pornography laws in school have a lot of their root. And so going from there, laws were passed at the federal and state level that say that children can't be exposed to pornographic material, both in terms of participation, of course, and also in terms of seeing. So you can't expose children to pornographic material. But the states broadly have exemptions for schools because what's considered pornographic is historically very difficult to define. If you think of like the Supreme Court justice saying like, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. There's an exemption for schools and libraries because based on like things that have merits, or think of the Statue of David, for example. you can show that to students without being considered showing them child porn. So so the history of it is that like anything that had to do with queer sexuality has a connection to the idea that it's pornographic, whether or not it's the act of sexual behavior. It's just the idea that queer sexuality is sexual, whether or not it has. So we were starting to trace that history and the ways in which that claim is being used to justify taking queer books out of the classroom. Because it's not just that you can't say gay, right? In the late 2000s, we had the no promoting homosexuality laws, the no promo homo laws, that very specifically said you can't say the word gay in a classroom. You can't say that it's okay to be gay. But this is actually a new iteration of these types of laws where it's no longer that you literally can't say the word gay. Now the argument is that you can't expose children to obscene material. And oh, isn't it funny that obscene material is also queer material? And so we consider this to be an epistemicide. It's a targeted erasure of queer knowledges and also queer ways of being, because it's not necessarily the idea that there are adult gay people. It is the idea that a trans person could exist, that a gay person could exist, that a gay penguin could exist. This in and of itself is an obscene identity.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great distinction to make, because it's not that we're talking about, as you said, we're not talking about specific sexual acts. We're talking about the fact that there are trans people, or there are gay couples, or there's just gay identity. And, you know, you say in the article too, that the rationale is this is not an acceptable lifestyle. This is a criminal offense. This is, that then becomes this idea of recruiting children and ideology. And, it goes from a morality judgment to more of a political ideology and a physical danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, how did that shift come about, and how is it being, because as you kind of ended your point, it's moved into new territory. So maybe you could tell us how that's working and how that came about.
Yeah, so it's the idea that gay people are a threat to children is clearly not a new thing, right? I talked about the child porn scares, the moral panic around that, but this goes back to the Save Our Children campaign in the mid 70s, where people were very concerned that if there was a gay teacher in the classroom, that they were going to molest your kid into homosexuality. And the idea is that gay people are not born, they're made, and they're made via child molestation, was kind of the argument that was made, whether tacitly or explicitly. So when you start from this position that children are asexual, that children are not sexual beings, but that the only natural sexuality is heterosexuality, then you can start to kind of trace the logic here, right? So that children are not sexual and they are inherently straight, because straight doesn't count as sexuality. Straight is the norm against which everything else is measured. So when you start with that belief, then the idea is that any discussion of exposure to image of a deviation from that invisible norm of heterosexuality, cisgender heterosexuality, is disgusting. It is obscene because it is exposing children to sex, and that is dangerous. And atrocities have been justified historically with the idea of protecting children. It is the one thing it is almost impossible to argue against, because who can say that they're against protecting kids from porn, right? How do you make that argument in Congress? So it's kind of a conservative backbone of a lot of legislation, because who argues against that? You can't. And if you already believe that asexual heterosexual children are being exposed to filth that's going to infect their brains and make them think they could be gay or trans, then you start to see like how these bills take shape.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. I keep saying that, but the idea that there's a backdrop behind childhood, which is, I think it's said in the article, there's a gender identity, there's a religious component, and there's other,
Race, classed.
right, and gendered kind of like boys do this, girls do this. That backdrop is what queerness is being contrasted to. So,
yeah.
And then what you're saying too is that then anything that falls outside of that backdrop or goes against it is seen as obscene, correct?
Yeah, and it's why I believe you can find similar claims being made against books relating to racial experiences in America also being classed as obscene, because they violate this kind of unspoken understanding of what the child is. And the child in America is white, middle class, Christian, cisgendered, and straight. And anything that might expose children to something outside of that is dangerous and is therefore obscene.
Right. And I think to kind of bring it home, bring it to a closer point, like I was reading the one book, Prince and Knight, which you mentioned in the book. And it's this delightful, story about a prince and a knight that go and slay a dragon, but they also happen to fall in love. And at the end, I think, get married. But the only thing that happens in the story is they may hold hands at one point. And that's the obscene material we're talking about, right? The holding of hands and then the marriage at the end, which are fine if they're between a man and a woman, but because it's two men, suddenly it becomes obscene, right? This is what we're talking about, right?
Right. Well, it makes me laugh because, a lot of the Florida law, I think in particular, does this where it says there can be no mention of sexuality in the classroom. But my answer is always, okay, open any children's book. If there's a mommy and a daddy, there's sexuality, because heterosexuality is sexuality. But it's so invisibilized that point is almost impossible to make, because it's like, well, no, it's not. That's normal. So the same kind of thing in this book where you have a male couple doing nothing that would be inappropriate in a children's book, holding hands, like any other children's book that has a mommy and a daddy holding hands, totally anodyne, totally sanitized, is filth. We have a book that we use. It's Mommy, Mama, and Me. I think we also mentioned it in the paper, and it's like, Mommy takes me to the park, Mama brings me down the slide. And that book is explicitly mentioned as obscenity in some of the discussion around these laws. It's a book for toddlers. I mean, it's they go about their day and mommy does one thing and mama does another. It's completely age appropriate. Nothing at all about it is sexualized, etc.
So then how does that, I know we're getting a little bit outside the bounds of the article, but how does that translate into ideology and obscenity? Because I guess it only does because you have the backdrop of the stuff we were just talking about. But when we hear the news clips and we hear the sound bites of there's obscene material in our schools, this is what they're talking about. So how does that become ideology? How does two men holding hands, slaying a dragon, and getting married constitute ideology?
Yeah, we are currently working on delves into that a little bit more, because I will say that it's a concerted project by the conservative right to create a world in which anything that is outside of white middle class heterosexual normed identity is quote unquote ideology, because that word doesn't really mean anything. It means everything at the same time. But it's a project that's being completed where you see key figures in right-wing media. Fox News, Tucker Carlson was an expert at this, now on Twitter, I suppose. Chris Rufo, he's at the Manhattan Institute, a right-wing think tank. They have multiple times explicitly talked about their goal is to take these words and make them mean anything bad. Critical race theory has gone through a very similar process where it means everything bad you don't like about your kid's school. So ideology, I think, now means something very similar. If you ask 9 out of 10 parents in a school board that are upset about something to say, well, what does ideology mean? I don't know if they would be able to define it, because it's not about what it means, it's about what it feels. And like what it feels like is that your way of life is under attack. Your values are no longer primal, like they don't have primacy in the country anymore. Like, you see people around you and you see gay couples and you hear about trans swimmers winning college scholarships, and you see about Black Lives Matter on the news, and you think, well, there's no place for me in this society anymore as a white, middle class, cisgender, heterosexual male. And so I feel like I'm under attack. And that feeling of attack is what I think drives a lot of these laws, because it's not about anything in particular, right? You can't think of anything more anodyne than a book about gay penguins with an egg, right? There's nothing about that. And Tango Makes Three. Nothing about that book is a threat to a child in any real tangible way, except if you feel that that book is teaching your child that it's okay to be gay, and you think that argument from I was discussing before, that gay people are made via grooming and child molestation, and you see it as a concerted attack on your child to turn them from your way of life.
Yeah, and the way it's done, as you were saying, is through this kind of repetition and kind of attention being pulled from any nuance to just kind of this hammer effect of certain words, like CRT. What does it mean? Well, it means white people feel bad. Well, not right.
Right. It's like making my child feel bad for being white is what that means. Grooming, what does that mean? It means telling my kid that a trans person exists. And you see it. I try to have some sympathy, because I think that there are people who see the world as turning outside of their control, and they don't feel comfortable, and they hear that, oh, this 5-year-old is now trans, and what does that mean? And it sounds scary, and I try to like have a sympathy for that, but it's hard when you see like the real damage that these laws have on children, when they're not even children who are queer or who identify as trans or gender nonconforming being erased from the classroom, but even in their ability to live in a pluralistic society, because they're no longer able to access books that will tell you the truth about slavery, or that they can't see Prince and Knight in their classroom, but they're going to live in a world where gay people exist, and what are they going to do?
When I also see it as this, and additionally to that, is this idea that, like, they're finally feeling what it feels like to be a minority in a system that is constantly actually putting you under threat and constantly putting you at odds with power structures that now are reinserting themselves on minority populations by co-opting that very narrative. So the majority is now under threat by the minority, and it's this weird switcheroo kind of thing where, like, my values are under attack, but they're not really. Like, nothing's really threatening the status quo, other than
No, of course not.
right, other than the fact that these books are in the library. It doesn't do much else. But let's talk about where, like, you looked at Idaho and that process of passing a law in Idaho, and I'd love for you to tell us how that works, because I think people are a little confused. I know I'm a little confused on how this happens, how this can actually happen in a community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say that this law actually, I believe, ultimately did not pass. It was eventually either vetoed or voted down, but you'll see the like of it in any school board, in any city, in any state. So the process begins, I think, with concerned community members who have seen the news or they have read on Facebook that, their children's schools are full of filth. And you can turn on the news, right, and you see these school board meetings with irate parents screaming about porn in their child's library. And here's all the books that I found that are inappropriate for my child, and you're exposing my child to X, Y, and Z. And the language of, obscenity and pornography starts getting thrown around, and that's something that's going to immediately trigger a reaction. I think politicians are kind of inherently reactionary, and as we were saying before, nothing gets someone moving like the threat to a child, especially like a sexual threat to a child. So once this becomes like a concern, you either start seeing like school boards who are afraid of being sued, or they're afraid of parents coming and rioting. They start passing laws that will pull these books from shelves. And you can actually, I'm pretty sure this is probably true everywhere, you can go onto your district school board and you can see the minutes and you can see kind of what's being discussed. And so you can see if this is happening at a local level. I'm sure the discussions are being had even if the laws aren't being passed. If it's not happening at the school board level, at the state level, there is a conservative effort in different media to kind of create this, to create this connection between queerness and obscenity that then becomes easy to legislate out. And so with the Idaho law, the law focused on child porn. And the law said that we're actually going to close the loophole that allowed schools and libraries to expose children to pornography, I believe was like the language of the bill. And that's pretty hard to argue against. As you said, you're in the car in the morning listening to the radio and you hear, oh, local law XYZ is going to prevent children from being exposed to porn in the library. You're not going to think anything about that. Like, oh, good, that's probably for the best. And the laws themselves will very rarely actually mention gay, queer, trans, etc., because that's not the point of the law. The law itself exists just to create like a vehicle for doing this. The actual work of defining obscenity is done at the local level. And so in this paper, we trace that in the hearings around the bill. Again, the bill itself, I don't believe ever actually uses the word gay, because it's not about that. The bill is about obscenity. And obscenity is really hard to define. And the definition, the legal statute is typically like whatever the reasonable adult in the community would consider to be obscene. I believe that's the actual language in most of the states. It's like the reasonable adult standard. And so it's not defined, it's just the reasonable adult will consider this to be inappropriate. And the work of defining what the reasonable adult considers inappropriate is done at the local level, where you have parents at the school board with their books about gay penguins, or you have people in the hearing with Prince and Knight. So it's the local people that are actually doing the work of defining what is obscene and what text should not be allowed. And that's where you get, okay, well, any books that mention queer or trans people are obscene, and that's what we're going to ban. And that gets actualized at the local level in the school boards, where the laws get translated into action. I'm sorry if that was confusing. I was trying to trace this big project.
Well, and I think that, let's walk through that just one more time with a little bit more. So it's kind of two process. So it can either start at the local level and move to the state level through school boards or local government. But then once the state makes the law, then it goes back down to the school board to determine what is obscene. But
yeah, so I think it's,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, so obviously, like, it is a two-way street, and it does, the backlash to the local level spurs a lot of the bigger action. But this goes back to DeSantis saying that the Don't Say Gay bill doesn't actually say the word gay. The insidious nature, what people have to be watching out for is that the laws of the states themselves typically will not say homosexuality, transgender. They won't queer. That language is typically not in the bill. The language of the bills is around obscenity and pornography. So the work is done at the local level to define that, to define what constitutes obscene or pornographic material. That's why there's like in Florida, you know, parents can report any inappropriate text to be removed, because what counts as inappropriate is by statute defined at a local level. State statute says that what's pornographic is what the reasonable adult in the community considers inappropriate. So there is no real legal definition of obscene or pornographic. It's just a community definition. And so that's why the work is so local.
Right. And the way it kind of works at the local level is, as you said, parents or even community members in some cases can, with no children in the school district or library, can challenge a book. And then the books that they are challenging almost 100% have to do with queerness and race, if it deals with it in some way that is offensive to white people, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to, I mean, I think that when you said people screaming at school board meetings, literally they're standing there yelling at the top of their lungs and saying,
yes,
the filth that's in there. That's not hyperbole, that's actual what's happening. And that's where, when you say doing the work, that's where the work is happening, that at those school board meetings, at those community events where parents are protesting, correct?
yes, right. And because there is no definition of pornography, it's defined by the community. And so that's them doing the work of defining pornography. They're saying, okay, well, we consider pornography to be anything that expresses non-heterosexual, non-cisgender identity to children. And they don't say it like that, but they'll go to the school board and they'll say, here is Prince and Knight, and on page 5 he holds the hand of another boy, and that is pornographic, that is sexual behavior. And that, you know, as multiple parents come in and do the same thing, and literally, I mean, screaming, yelling matches, because they're in their mind protecting children from porn. So there is a lot of emotion, it's very visceral. And they're saying this is obscene. And the school boards, in reaction, you know, they move to take out any book from the library that a parent might object to, or any book that has non-heterosexual, non-cisgender identity, because the community, the reasonable adult of the community, has come together and decided that those are what should be considered inappropriate.
And the pushback, when people show up and say why those books need to be included, their voice isn't as powerful because of the way the laws are defined, correct? Or is this because it's a silence in effect at many levels, and one of the levels is you can have a reasonable objection and you can have a reasonable advocacy, but the objection somehow always wins.
Well, right. Well, they're the louder voices in the room, right? It's like they're there screaming about pornography, you going in and reasonably saying, hey, I don't actually think that And Tango Makes Three should be considered pornography because it's just two penguins and an egg. That's not going to stick with people to the same extent. And also, angry people show up, and so you might have 9 out of 10 members of the community feel that books like Prince and Knight should be allowed, but the 1 out of 10 is the one who's going to show up and be upset and go to the hearing and bring a quote and yell, and so that's what's going to get remembered.
Right, and the rhetorical devices that this whole process uses are incredibly effective as well. Otherwise,
Yeah.
So,
It's the language of protecting children. That's nothing is more powerful to us as a culture than the idea that our children are under attack and we need to save them.
yes, unless it's gun violence, but that's a different conversation.
Well, save them from their souls, right? Not their bodies.
Right. And that's one of the things that I heard about this whole discussion was that, like, appealing to the humanity of the other side, like, you're hurting children, queer children, trans children, that's the point for some of these people. Like, they want to,
Yes.
this lifestyle is unacceptable and needs to be taken away from our society, erased, silenced, and that's the point, right? That's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that there's levels. I think that there are certainly people who believe and will say, gay people should not be allowed to exist in our society via whatever method you think is appropriate, right? So there are people who are that extreme and that violent, and they are out there and they're saying that. And there are the people who just think, hey, I don't think my kid should read porn in school. And the problem is that they're working towards the same goal right now, because what they're the effect of going into the school board and saying, I agree, my kids shouldn't be exposed to porn. And I heard that this book is in school and this book is porn because it's gay, is doing the same work as the person who says gay people shouldn't exist, because it's taking any knowledge, any experience, any reference to queerness out of the school environment and out of children's ability to experience, see, learn about, identify as. And I think some people are very ill-intended and they are out there to do huge damage to everybody. And I think there are people who think that they're doing good, but their intent to save children is having these very negative impacts, because ultimately, like, kids are queer. There are queer kids in the universe, right? Like, they exist. There are straight kids who are going to live in society and are going to see gay people and trans people, and they need to be okay with that. And the I struggle to think of how you respond to it, because those are two such different approaches to the problem, but they're having the same impact of, like, taking all this knowledge out of the school.
Right. And it's part of a larger pronged, it's one prong in a larger attack on public education. And
well, that's another thing that this project, the larger conservative project, is against public education. If you look at, like, the Heritage Foundation's website, they talk about that pretty explicitly.
right. And we have presidential hopefuls saying that they want to get rid of the Department of Education.
Yeah.
One of the day one I'm coming in. But
right, getting rid of the Department of Education and making every public school a charter school, and vouchers, and it's all part of a larger project.
Right. And this is insidious because it's really targeting a very fragile and marginalized community again. So what can we do about these laws? I guess the point of the paper is to be aware of how this works, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's such an important first step, because I think of how many people in this Idaho law. I went and listened and found these, quote, expert witnesses who testified for the law, saying that this law needed to be passed, had run radio ads, and they had done interviews on local talk radio talking about, we have to get child porn out of schools. And I think the first step is that people need to tune into this, what's happening in their community, what conversations are happening. And if you hear something like that, to be suspicious, because you can be pretty dang certain that your child is not being exposed to porn at school. Like, I'm pretty willing to bet that that's true. And so if you start hearing that, like, that should make you perk up and listen, because I think the natural reaction is to go, oh yeah, I agree that there shouldn't be porn in schools, the end. And to kind of turn the channel and ignore it. So by tuning in and listening to these conversations, you can actually step in and go to these school board meetings and go to these community meetings and be a voice in the room against it. Because while, like, those louder voices are going to show up, it matters if there's no voices there disagreeing with it. So to go to your school board meeting and say like, hey, I actually don't want this book removed. I don't agree with this policy. You shouldn't get to control what my child gets to learn. Those arguments are being shown to have power. And there is like a counter movement to this Moms for Liberty, anti queer, pro censorship movement. And it's parents showing up and saying, like, hey, you don't get to control what my child learns. And so I think that's like the heart of it is just to be involved, listen to like what's happening in your community, show up, disagree with it, write emails to your local politicians, your state politicians, and call them and just show that like there is another side that's willing to be vocal and willing to show up just as much as the the anti-queer side is.
Right. And one of the things when I was interviewing people about critical race theory was that they said, this isn't, if it works against critical race theory, then they're coming for everything else using the same tactics.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and they are. Yeah, they 100% are.
Exactly. So they've just reframed the critical race theory into the obscenity, anti-gay, and whatever the next thing is, they're going to use the same tactics. So I think it's incredibly important, the work you're doing to kind of pull out what they're doing and how they're doing it and making people aware of these processes, because as we said, it works, so they keep using them.
And they're already coming for American history, right? You heard that there was a presidential hopeful who is defending the benefits potentially of slavery.
Right.
There's lots of local schools. I can name a district in Florida that banned the Diary of Anne Frank. Mm-hmm. Discussions of the Holocaust, discussions of Nazi atrocities, of slavery are also on the chopping block. It's going to be any kind of knowledge that is considered objectionable to, frankly, white Christian nationalists. And that's almost all of our identities in some way, or our histories, or our family's histories. If you're not someone who really is like, oh, queerness is not my thing, it's non-Christian religions next, it's this next, like it's always going to be moving for the next target. It's never going to stop at one thing. They're not going to be happy once Black and trans kids are out of the classroom.
That's right. And I mean, they're coming for us all. So thank you for the work you're doing. And is there anything else you would like to kind of add as kind of wrapping us up here?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for reading the paper and for wanting to talk about it. It's something that we feel really passionate about, and that we're constantly on the lookout for. And so I hope that maybe some of the listeners, get involved and they're inspired to go to their school board meetings or their local county meetings and stand up against this really insidious process.